If you're not interested in long formatted videos, I will have the time-lapse version of the painting portion listed in the description if you guys will prefer that. But other than that, hey guys, and welcome back to another video. So today I am going to be showing you guys basically the process of me working on this watercolor piece of Eveland of Niji Sanji En. So we're starting off with the sketching portion, which I did do on my iPad. So I did my sketch and the kind of like rough colors of the piece so that I could kind of plan things out. Once that was done, I decided to take the sketch and print it out onto 2 A4 sheets of paper so that I can prep it to be the same size of my watercolor paper, which is this Baohong Academy watercolor paper pad. So this one is 15 by 10.2, so I had to tile my sketch together so it fits the size of this watercolor paper. So this watercolor paper pad is gummed on all sides, minus this little section in the inner center part so that you can cut away the paper after when you're done painting with it. So just when you're painting, it will dry evenly while you're working. So because this is a paper pad and that every side is gummed, it means that I can't transfer my sketch the normal way, which usually I would either print out my sketch and use a light pad underneath so that we can shine my sketch underneath my watercolor paper and then sketch on top of the watercolor paper very cleanly. The second method I do is just drawing right on top of the watercolor paper, but because I don't want to go through damaging the paper, getting my grubby hands on it, or even doing just too much erasing, the other way I did it, which you guys saw, is that you take a pencil. This time I used the Prismacolor Col-Erase and shaded the entire backside of the paper of my sketch, and then you place it on top of your watercolor paper pad, and then you can take a kind of like a blunt object similar to a writing utensil. A lot of people use ballpoint pen to do this. There's some other tools you can probably use, and you basically trace on top of your sketch to imprint your sketch onto the watercolor paper, because hopefully as long as like your graphite, a lot of people do use graphite, but I decided to use the Prismacolor Col-Erase in the color Carmine because I like usually working with the warmer color instead of having graphite, because graphite does get a little bit messy when painting with watercolors just because you can push around excess graphite and stuff, and I don't really want that gray debris everywhere, especially if I'm painting like a person, so I don't want to add gray to their skin tone if it's not needed. So for the most part, this part was actually quite simple and it actually transferred pretty well. So this method is very similar to using carbon paper. So if you have carbon paper, you would place the carbon paper, usually the darker side, directly onto your watercolor surface or whatever you're trying to transfer onto, and then you would lay your paper on top of that, like your sketch, and do the same method of tracing, and then the carbon paper will imprint its little carbon particles right onto your paper. But because I don't own any carbon paper at the moment, I had to do it this way because this is the only way it could kind of work out without me having to pry open the watercolor paper pad. So I mentioned earlier that the paper pad is glued on all sides, and like I said, it helps with the drying of the piece because you don't really have to worry too much about your paper buckling and drying all wavy. So for me, this one really helps if I want to do like larger washes especially. And now that I've been working a little bit more with hot press paper and trying to kind of paint bigger, I like doing a lot of big washes, so I don't really want to worry about buckling, so paper pads are very great for me. So the sketch is basically done at this point, so you can see that there's like faint lines everywhere. It did a pretty good job with the transfer. Like I said, it would be a little bit darker if you actually used maybe like a 6B pencil or something on the back of the sketch paper and then traced it. But like I said, I think the red works quite well for what I wanted. But for Ike himself, I wanted to make sure I didn't lose all the details because I like painting and drawing the figure the most, so I want to make sure that this isn't going to be entirely butchered. So I went ahead and did another sketch right on top using the mechanical pencil. And I like using the mechanical pencil because it does leave a little bit less graphite debris. So yeah, and it keeps like a nice sharp clean line when I'm kind of doing some sketches, and it requires me not to have too thick of lines, because after some point after the painting, I do paint the lines with watercolor to cover up the lines and kind of make sure that each section is matched appropriately with the color that makes things look a little bit softer. So you guys are gonna have to bear with me, as I'm not the most like eloquent speaker or just good at explaining things. But let's move on to my materials. So this is the watercolor palette that I usually use, and it's the one I've had for several years right now. Most of the paints are from Holbein, but if you want to know the specific paints, I'll leave them in the description. But yeah, so I have a Hakke brush and a kind of like a brush for washes, which were the first two brushes I showed. The other ones are the miscellaneous brushes I'm going to be using to paint each individual thing. For my paper towel or drying surface for my brushes, I'm using an old dish towel kind of thing, just because it's kind of ruined, and so I use it for painting. And then we have a jar of water. I actually have two of them. But prior to painting, I am going to be using my liquid watercolor. So they're a little bit more how to explain this, permanent compared to just normal watercolor. So I feel like it's a little bit more safe for me to do an overall wash on top of the entire thing without worrying of lifting. So I like to do this as kind of my initial wash, and I'm kind of like trying to set a temperature for the entire piece. So in my color comp, I actually had the entire piece to be a little bit on the warmer side. Now, with hindsight in mind, I actually think I could have went significantly warmer with the yellow, but the yellow looked very jarring to me once I first placed it down. But once we start getting in the leaves, the shelf, and Ike himself, everything becomes a little bit less warm, and it doesn't become probably as saturated or as dark as I would have liked. I'll get into that a little bit later, because pretty much it's kind of like the same way how I approach my digital drawing, but I'll get back into that a little bit later so I can explain what I did here. In between layers, I will be using a hairdryer to dry the surface evenly so that I can constantly paint and not have to play the waiting game with the watercolor paper drying. So for the most part, I'm working wet on wet for a lot of these leaves, because I don't want them to have like super sharp edges because they are in the background. So as things start to dry, I add a little bit more of other colors, and then once that layer has fully dried, I will add in some more leaves just to make sure that we kind of have a sense of depth. And then that's kind of it for the background behind the window pane. Yeah, I think everything else is in front of the window pane, so I'll be adding more detail as well as making sure things look a little bit more clean and crisp as we move forward. I am going to be painting Ike last, pretty much. I do hop around a little bit, but I want to focus mostly on the background. So like I said, similarly to how I work digitally, I like to establish the background as much as I can, because it's going to help me figure out the colors that I would like to use for the figure. And a mistake that I kind of did, and it would have saved me a little bit of heartache in terms of this process, is that in my color comp that I did digitally, which I did reference quite a bit, especially for the background, I did not include Ike's colors when I did the background. So for me, the digital comp for colors would have been a good exercise for me to make sure that Ike also fits in the background with the color temperature and everything. I did wing his colors a little bit, so hopefully it doesn't look too out of place, but I just wanted to make sure that adding blues to a warm composition like this didn't look too jarring, because for me, Ike has blue, white, black, and gold that I like to take into consideration. And for me, white and black are usually not an issue. I am comfortable kind of shifting those colors into a more cooler range or a warmer range. But let's say like gold or like blue or yellow or anything like that, it's a little bit hard for me to shift without making it look a little bit too weird. yeah, I think it'll make more sense once we start to actually color in Ike. But for the most part, I'm still trying to do kind of like the base color and trying to fill in things for the background as much as I can, because I need to know how dark the background is going to be so that I know how dark and how contrasted I want Ike to be in the foreground. So that's why I usually like to establish the background as much as I can. If you watch me how I work digitally, I tend to do the background first because it always gives me a good set range, I guess, for the skin tone, which I usually start first for any of the characters that I do draw. So onto the painting portion. After I did a majority of the background, I'm going in and doing some of the smaller details for the background, such as like branches and flowers. So for the flowers, I did do kind of a little bit of a blue base, and then I'm going in with a little bit of a darker blue, and then if I can, I try to do wet on wet to have a little bit of that natural gradation and letting the wet on wet kind of mingle together a little bit, because I think I do struggle a little bit of wanting things to look super smooth, and I do like doing wet on dry and then trying to feather out that wet edge so that it kind of fades into the previous color underneath so it looks more like a gradient, but that doesn't always work. I do find that hot pressed paper dries a little bit faster than my cold press and lifts a little bit less easily, I guess, compared to some cold press papers that I've used. Obviously, each paper is going to differ, so it's good to do some tests, which I did not do, which is probably not good, but I did feel very comfortable just using hot press paper in general, so I kind of just winged it, even though a test would probably be a good idea. So when I did these flowers, by the way, these flowers aren't like real flowers. For the most part, I think the one in the very front is like a lily, but the other ones, I basically made them similar to peonies, even though blue peonies do not exist. I have seen blue peonies before, but I'm pretty sure they're just like fabric flowers. They're still very, very pretty. But I'm pretty sure there's no such thing as a blue peony, so unless there's like some way to dye them. I know like people dye carnations the same way, like you chop the stem, like the bottom of the stem, and put like blue food coloring or something into the water, and a white carnation will suck up the water and the pigment actually goes into the petals or something. I remember doing this as a kid, like for elementary, for like Mother's Day, and we would make like pink carnations or like purple carnations and stuff, and it looks really cute. But that's just me rambling at this point. So I'm basically just going and trying my best to balance out colors here and there, but also I think I was a little bit too hesitant when it came to the background. There's some areas that aren't as clear because I wasn't too sure if I wanted to really push the contrast of some of the colors, and because of the color temperature and wanting everything to kind of be lit by the window, most of the things were supposed to probably be backlit, which means that the closer you are to the foreground, it's supposed to be significantly darker. Now, I'm very timidly placing shadows right now, so the majority of the clothing on his shoulder-ish areas and around his, I guess like the collar and stuff, are white. So I started actually with a light blue wash, and then later on I am going to try to push the colors a little bit more to be a lot darker, because like I said, I'm gonna have to balance out colors as we move along, because once I add in the black and some of the blue of his outfit, the whites of his outfit looked too washed out, and then at some point the whites look too dark because I actually haven't done the full intensity of some of the other colors. So both traditionally and digitally, I do think there's like a balance of colors depending on surrounding colors. Also, apologies that a lot of this is going to be out of focus. Just like a little portion. I tried my best to not include too much footage from this blurry stage, but I did film like almost an hour of me painting with this blurry camera situation. Oh, let me talk about the length of time. So I haven't done the full calculation of how long this took, since I'm kind of taking like snippets. Well, not snippets. I filmed the whole process just from different angles and shifting things, just making sure that certain angles suit different parts of the piece. Like once we start to work on Ike, especially like during his face and stuff, I zoom in, but once we start working on like the clothing and stuff a little bit further away, I might want to back up the camera. So sometimes I do forget to change the settings. But the amount of time I took to paint this, it was quite a few hours. I did do this across 3 days, because I think it's partially because I had to do some things in the morning and stuff, and I'm not able to continuously work on it. But also this piece just took quite a bit of time. Like I said, it might have been also because I'm not too confident with painting nowadays. I don't paint as much as I used to, and I paint very differently compared to how I used to paint. I think, yes, when I used to do watercolor at the very beginning, when I started making videos and stuff, I think it's like, let me think, during my uni days, I believe, I did more like cell shading for watercolor along with having line art done prior. So it kind of felt like coloring a coloring book a little bit. But nowadays, because I do like doing the line work afterwards so that we can make things look softer by matching the line work to this specific object, it does take me a little bit longer, and I feel like I do have to be a little bit more careful with how I place certain colors or my line quality with my brushwork. So in previous sessions, I've talked about this before. I am a very lazy painter. If I can paint with just one brush, I will. But I've noticed recently that the thinness of the line that I want, I cannot achieve with the brush that I have, just because it truly doesn't come to a certain point compared to how much I thought it actually would. And I'm talking about my Raphael Kolinsky brush. I used to have one, well, you guys probably see it in this video. It's the one with the black barrel, and that one used to come to a super sharp point, and I would use it like literally for everything. But over the years, I definitely kind of beat it a little bit too much, and it's become very puffy and it doesn't hold a point anymore. And I bought another Raphael Kolinsky brush, which you guys will also see. It's the one with the kind of reddish barrel, and that one held its point for a little bit, but it was never truly a super sharp point, so it was hard for me to do all the painting plus the line work with it. So sometimes I will use my script liner, which is the one with I think it's the blue-ish barrel with the tape around it. I used to use that one like a heck of a lot, and it's supposed to be like a script liner brush. But I decided to pull out a different brush. I'm gonna see if I can find it. Let me see. Yes, I think it's this one. So this one is I think it's Pentel. It's like a Fude brush, but I believe it's like a designer brush. So it's very long and thin, and it comes to a very sharp point. Mine is slightly curved, which does throw me off a little bit, but it was really great for me to learn how to get a good consistency of water to paint, and for me to get sharp lines, which hopefully I'll be able to show you guys a little bit later in this video of how much pressure you're gonna have to use for like a brush like this, or even like brushes in general if you're trying to do line work with just the tip of the brush. It's definitely a good exercise in my opinion to learn how to do the line work with the brush, because there's a lot of like hand control or trying to be patient and slowly work with the line work. I guess it like also depends on your workflow and your own style. If you actually like to do things more quickly, a little bit more messy, compared to a person who wants maybe more control, or a person who wants thicker lines versus thinner lines, it kind of all just depends. So we have now moved on to the painting of Ike. So I started off with the skin, and I started off kind of with a base tone with keeping the lighting in mind, that I wanted the light to come kind of from the upper left. I've kind of tricked myself a little bit from wanting things to be a little bit more backlit to be instead have it come from the upper left, which I default to quite a bit, but I want to establish that right away in the face. So I put the right side in shadow, got that Rembrandt's triangle for the cheek as well, and then after that I do bleed a little bit of that skin tone color into his hair, but I wanted to start with his hair with a base. So I struggle picking what kind of color I want to paint his hair, because it's almost like, it's like a brown, but it has blue, but it's almost like has this brassy, I don't know if it's like bronze. I'm not sure how to describe it, but it feels like it has a little bit of green in it, has a little bit of blue, it has a little bit of brown. So I've been kind of flip-flopping, and I feel like that's the same way with how I paint his eyes. I know his eyes are a little bit more on the greeny yellow side with blue at the very top. But how I paint it usually is actually a little bit more yellowy, so apologies that that's probably not as accurate. It's just, I think maybe I just convinced myself and I wasn't looking at the reference as closely as I probably should have. So for the hair, after I had kind of established the color that I wanted for each kind of, like, I kind of think about it in left, right, and middle. So the left, I wanted to have lighter colors because it is exposed more to the light. And then the middle is kind of like what I would consider his true color of the hair that I would like to have established. And then the right side, I'm gonna kind of finagle and kind of change a little bit as much as I can after things have dried to kind of push it more and more into shadow. So I might add a little bit more blues, a little bit more grays and purples into that area just to push it back a little bit and make that area a little bit more cooler. Hopefully that makes sense. Yeah, so because of the way how I treat colors and stuff and how I work, I often go back and forth, especially after I do the line work. I'm going to have to push some of the tones a little bit further, and this tends to be on the hair and the face because sometimes I get too scared of pushing the shadows in the face to be too dark or too cool. And sometimes me establishing the line work actually helps with that, because my line work tends to be the darkest thing for that section. So let's say like I drew let's say his hand actually. So for his hand, if I wanted to kind of like test my boundaries, I would make the lightest part be hit by the light, so I'll leave that the lightest part, but the darkest part would be the line work. And then if I want to add shadows, I would kind of have to pick a tone in between my light of the hand where it's getting hit by the light source and then my line art color. So it kind of makes me have a little range established for me, so that's why I kind of like going back and forth when I can. Another thing I really enjoyed painting actually, and hopefully it shows up a little bit better later on, is actually the whites of his jacket or shawl, because the whites are gonna look very gray and very cool and maybe a little bit too dark to be actually like a white article of clothing. But once we put in the blacks and the blues, a lot of the colors actually don't look that dark. But I do want the underside of his cloak or whatever it's called to be a little bit on the darker side, because they shouldn't really be hitting that much light anyways. So yeah, I'm gonna be really pushing the shadows more on the right side and on that right collar flap thing near his lapel. So yeah, hopefully it looks a little bit better. I did try my best to push it as much as I could once I actually put in the black and the blues. I'm trying to think what else to talk about, because for the most part I do flip-flop between doing like a base color and then letting that dry, and then I'll be working on another area's base color before I can add any kind of shadow. So you can see the drying time is quite quick. So you can see that on the book portion, any of those little splotches was probably me attempting to place more color down, but some of the edges have already dried, so it's not like seamless. But if you do want like a seamless transition, I do recommend doing wet on wet if you can. I think it's just a little bit easier. I think for like cold press, it's also easy to get a transition that way too, but it's also easier for me to do like wet on dry and then feather out the edge into the previous layer to make a gradation. But this one I do worry a little bit. I don't know. I think it works out in my favor when I start to do the clothing folds here, because I'm kind of using the drying time a little bit effectively here so that I can establish some clothing folds where some of the edges have dried prior, and we can kind of have those harsh edges kind of indicate some folds and a little bit of the planes of the shirt, if that makes sense. So hopefully those read a little bit correctly. I know I'm not the most proficient in watercolor painting, but watercolor is truly one of my favorite mediums just to work in general. I think this is because like prior to even getting introduced to alcohol markers, which I don't use too often, and after being in a slump while doing digital art, watercolor painting has been like a way for me to add color to my pieces without having a lot of materials, in a sense. I do think like it's recommended to have like watercolor paper if you're doing a watercolor piece, and there's like a lot of different sets of watercolor that people think like aren't very good. I do think student grade ones, and my favorite in terms of kind of like cheap alternatives, it's on like more like student grade. I definitely like the Sakura Koi watercolor set, like the portable one, a lot, like the traveler set. I've always had like the tiny one, the one's like about the size of your fist, and it only has, I think it's like 12 to 16 colors, but it was always enough for me to play around with. And I would use like mixed media paper. You can find cheap watercolor paper. I remember getting some from like the university, kind of like a corner store kind of thing. It was like in a, I don't know, I don't want to like expose which university I went to, but it was kind of like this little convenience store type, stationery store-ish type thing, but they had watercolor paper there, and it wasn't the best watercolor paper, but it did work with my paints for what I needed it to do, and I used it for school projects for a lot of my sketches and stuff because I didn't want to invest into the larger papers that I actually still own the larger papers because they were expensive. I have these humongous, I think 600 GSM paper, and they're like 24 by 30 inches, cold press. I think they're arches. I think I have 3 arches watercolor paper still, and I don't want to touch them because they're expensive, and I wish to maybe one day tear them down to the correct size and do some actually finished pieces that look really nice. But for the most part, I'm quite happy using these kinds of hot press paper. The Baohong, I did get off of Amazon at some point, and the price point wasn't gonna be like my wallet's crying. I've seen, I think it's Fabriano and maybe it's Arches. There's another brand of hot press paper that makes me want to cry because it's like, I think it's the same size as this one with a little bit less pages, but it's like, I think 3 to 4 times the amount of the price, so it's kind of insane. Okay, so now that I kind of rambled enough, you can see the brush I'm using is actually the, I think, yeah, this is the Pentel Fude brush, I believe, and this is what I'm using to do the line work. So for the most part, the paint to water ratio was kind of a little bit on the drier side, but I noticed that if I don't have enough moisture, the brush wouldn't even let the paint flow at all, so it made things skip quite easily. So I do think there's kind of like a fine line between a good flow or having it too dry or adding too much water and then it kind of gets too thick. So yeah, it was kind of hard for me to get a grasp of it, but you can see that these get pretty thin lines. I got pretty thin lines also when I did his eyes and a little bit of his face, but in his hair I had thin lines for the most part until I got to like the right side of his hair, which started to get like much thicker lines, but I don't think it looks too bad. I tried my best to stay with the same pool of paint so that I could have a little bit of consistency, but you can see that once I added in the line work, some of the areas, especially like in the hair and then the skin, no longer look dark. So I need to add another shadow to the underside of his chin. I might need to push the right side of his hair a little bit more so that we can push the contrast to be a little bit more intense. But yeah, I'm noticing like a lot of the gold areas that I painted, I forgot to put into shadow, and also the book, I also forgot to put into shadow, probably because I was waiting for areas to dry. But I'm just simply putting in just like a small area. Like I said, I kind of treated some of these areas more like cell shading rather than like a soft shading, like I do usually in the face, where I try to my best to make sure that little Rembrandt's triangle where the sun hits that other opposite cheek to be nice and soft as it moves away from the harsh sunlight, if that makes sense. So, I still think watercolor painting is still one of my favorite mediums, even though like I don't use it a lot in my sketchbook anymore. I do think the texture and the way it has, I guess like some color has like granulation and stuff. I don't think any of my colors that I own has any granulation, but I think it'd be fun to play with in the future if I ever want to invest into more colors. But I think for now, because I don't paint that much, I probably won't buy new paints. Even though like I'm so tempted to go on Jet Pens and just look at new paints and see if I could pick up new colors from the Holbein section, because I love Holbein paints quite a bit. They're quite vibrant. I like the pigment quality. They're come in very convenient sized tubes and stuff. And yeah, if I ever go back to Japan, I will definitely go and hit up a art shop again and look for the Holbein paints, because they were cheaper when I was in Japan at the time. So yeah, maybe if I go to Japan again, I will just pick up paints in there instead of buying them off of Jet Pens or something. So for the background, after doing the line work, I knew that I wanted to push the background a lot more after, so I am going to do that at some point. And I almost forgot to do the lines for his gloves. They do get a little bit janky, so let's not pay attention too closely to how I space these out, because you can see I kind of gave up at some point because I'm leaving the lines kind of thick in some areas, which doesn't look that nice. But like I said, if you don't focus on the hands too much, it doesn't bother me that much. So I do want to paint more though. Hopefully me working on a larger size will help me try to paint some larger pieces that incorporate some backgrounds, because I think I treat my backgrounds the same way how I do it digitally. It's not very detailed, and the more detail I put, sometimes things look a little bit off, and it might be because I lack the courage to do perspective. Oh, by the way, let's talk about this portion actually, because this part actually I found super fun to do. So I have a thing of white gouache paint, and I usually use this as a refill for my Himi gouache, but I decided to just pick out paint directly from the tube, and I did a little bit of hair strands here and there. It does dry a little bit cooler, which is why I tried to mix in a little bit of yellow to some of my little speckles. So as you guys know, just like my digital art, I like to add little dust particles that catch sunlight. It just makes things look a little bit more magical and a little bit prettier. So I wanted to add that to Ike and kind of his surrounding. So I kind of go back and forth of using this, like the Pentel Fude brush and another brush, and I'm dry brushing the little dots so that they kind of have a airbrushed effect and they look like they glow. So yeah, dry brushing I really like doing a lot, so I can do it to get some things to look like they're glowing or a little bit fuzzy. And I think that is it for this Ike piece. So you guys can see kind of how messy some of my painting skills are. Also, don't mind my nails. I literally broke them when I went on a little food date with two of my friends. Yeah, because I hopped out of one of my friend's van and I didn't realize how far up her van was, because she has like this Japanese van, so it's not the same as like a mom van or anything like that. So I kind of broke my nails trying to latch to the door. So okay, so here's the full piece for Ike, and yeah, I do like how it looks. I do wish I made it a lot warmer though, and yeah, maybe I could have pushed the background more. Oh yeah, I wanted to show you guys this. So we're gonna actually pry Ike away from the entire pad. So I'm taking X-Acto knife. This is actually the X-Acto knife I used for screen tones. So I'm just sliding this across. I highly recommend if you have a slightly blunter object compared to an X-Acto knife, it might work a little bit better. I was very scared of running into the problem of not holding the knife at the right angle and cutting into the paper below or cutting into the paper above. But basically you're just trying to break the seal all the way across where the gummed edge is, and then you can basically release the paper from the entire pad, and then once you do that you can use the next piece of paper underneath and it'll be ready to go. This is also a very good option if you like to travel and paint, so you don't have to tape your paper down to a surface. Yeah, so there's Ike freed from the pad. It does curl a little bit. I don't know if it's because the way I cut it, but they curl inwards a little bit, so I'm just kind of bending the paper and hopefully not creasing it so that he kind of lays a little bit more flat. And I'll try to paint more in the future, but I think that's it. And yeah, I think that's it. Bye!